Abingdon Independent Chapel in the square was built in 1700. It was a simple building supported by 2 large wooden pillars, reputedly the masts of the Mayflower, which were floated up the Thames when the ship was dismantled. Sadly, that was not the case. Another church claimed those, but our masts, they were masts, they came from the same era, as confirmed by carbon dating at Harwell. A new church was added onto the front in 1862, which is now the restaurant Ask. By the mid-1960s, South Abingdon was growing rapidly, and there were no churches planned there. So it was decided to sell the existing, now called Congregational Church, and with the proceeds build an ecumenical one in South Abingdon. A site near where the Midget pub is was provisionally acquired. The congregation was about 70 strong, so it was decided to explore joining with another church. The Baptists weren't enthusiastic, but don't tell them next week when they come and join with us. Discussions with Trinity Methodist Church resulted in the 2 churches sharing services at Trinity from July 1968. There were problems with the sale of the old church, however, mainly due to planning restrictions. In those days, the A34 went along High Street and Ox Street, and was no Stratton Way, so Bath Street was part of the one-way system round the town. There was no parking in front of the old church, and although the garden behind the church was purchased from the Probation Service, and options to purchase some garages to the rear via Bath Street were acquired, access was denied on the grounds that it led to the A34. So there were troubles with the A34 even then. Although it wasn't an attractive property at that time, as the time ran out for the site in South Abingdon, in the meantime, in 1972, the Congregational Church became part of the United Reformed Church. So some years later, in 1978, we became a local ecumenical partnership here at Trinity, when sharing agreements were signed by both denominations. Upon the subsequent sale of the old church, sadly for much less than it would have been worth if parking had been possible, the proceeds were used to modernise what is now the Conduit Centre. But what were the important aspects of church life for the URC people which we brought with us? Some, of course, were shared by Methodists too, such as the priesthood of all believers and the care of the congregation in small groups, either by elders in the URC or by class leaders in Methodism. But there were 3 more at the heart of the URC: in the participation of all church members in decision-making via the church meeting, the choice of a minister by almost unanimous consensus at the church meeting, and the distribution of bread and wine to the congregation in their seats by the elders. But new things were particularly appreciated by being united with Methodists, and they were the covenant service to remind us of our promises, the support of the circuit, and the increased opportunities for young people in the uniformed groups, youth groups, and more active participation in putting on shows and musicals, etc. So, altogether, a good move.
Right, now for the Methodist side. It's thought that Methodists began meeting in Abingdon in a house, probably in West St Helens Street, in 1816. In 1823, they built a small chapel in Sturt Street, and in 1846 moved to a larger building in Ox Street. This was on the site of the entrance to the post office sorting office. It was still there when we first moved to Abingdon in 1965, but it was demolished when the large office block to the left of the sorting office entrance was built. As the congregation continued to grow, a further new building was needed, and in 1875 this church was built and called Trinity Wesleyan Church. The other branch of Methodists, the Primitive Methodists, or Prims as they were sometimes referred to, had been meeting in Abingdon since 1835 and had chapel in Spring Road. This was on the site of the Abingdon Bed Shop on the corner of Spring Road and Edward Street. The shop has now moved. It was probably a temporary building made of corrugated iron, as were a lot of these small primitive Methodist chapels. And in fact, it probably looked much the same as the old bed shop does now. In 1932, the two branches of Methodism joined, and Trinity Wesleyan Church became Trinity Methodist Church. As we've already heard, the members of the Congregational Church moved to share with the congregation here in 1968, bringing their minister with them. For the next 17 years, Trinity had two ministers, one URC and one Methodist. At that time, Trinity Methodist Church had a membership of well over 200. There was a women's fellowship, a Wesley Guild, a junior church and a youth fellowship, and in addition, an adult choir. There was a youth choir as well. After 10 years of sharing together, in 1978, a sharing agreement was signed, and the two congregations united to become Trinity Church. They already had a lot in common, but the special emphasis of the traditions of URC and Methodist were brought together to enrich each other. The agreement was signed during the morning service on Trinity Sunday, 21st of May 1978, almost exactly 40 years ago.